But now it's reminiscent to me as well of what's happening in the UK, most particularly in Oxford and Cambridge, in relationship to the 15-minute cities. Now, the 15-minute cities are put forward as a solution to the problem of undue distance to travel. And so the idea is that, wouldn't it be lovely if we had walkable neighborhoods where everything you needed was within easy reach? And, you know, I have some sympathy for that because I've gone to monoculture suburbs, let's say, that are nothing but row upon row upon row of identical houses with no churches and no bars and no community centers and, you know, the shopping centers at a distance, and that doesn't look like an optimal urban model. But I looked into the C40 websites. The C40 is the consortium of municipalities that have signed on to the 15-minute city plan. And I read in their own documentation, this is relevant to the tri-state city idea, that their goals are to reduce caloric consumption to 2,500 calories a day by force, essentially, within the next 15 years, to ensure that the peasant class, which is everybody but the elitists, can't fly more than one time every 3 years, to not merely shift private car ownership from fossil fuel to electric, which is fundamentally impossible because the grid can't handle it, but to eliminate 90% of private car ownership so that people are forced to take, you know, unbelievably expensive in terms of time utilization and non-existent public transportation systems, and to limit the amount of travel that people can do outside of their neighborhoods. And, you know, and then I watch the legacy media claim that pointing that out is something akin to a right-wing conspiracy, which it most certainly isn't, because you can just find the bloody documentation online. And then I look at places like China, which have taken this to an extreme. 600 million closed-circuit TV cameras in China, one for every 1.5 persons, watching the Chinese all the time, able to monitor them 100% by face, and also to identify them by gait, and to limit their ability to do absolutely anything, to buy, to sell, to travel, to move, to leave their neighborhood, with this top-down surveillance system that perversely and consciously some of the Chinese engineers have actually named Skynet, and in a conscious attempt to produce a positive version of, you know, the absolutely catastrophic, apocalyptic artificial intelligence that was in the bloody Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. And you can't even talk about this stuff without sounding like a raving conspiratorialist, but there it is. Now, tell me more about the tri-state city. So what have you seen? Because I don't know anything about it, neither does anybody else watching, I presume, except for, you know, those who've gone down the rabbit hole with you.
So the smart city goes beyond mere optics. You know, they're installing those cameras all over Hong Kong. They were doing that when I left. That's in Hong Kong. But what I'm getting to is these smart cities are clearly coming, and they're already here to some degree every time we use our cards and that sort of thing. But they're clearly taking it to a higher level of complete control. And again, this isn't conspiratorial. They say they're going to do it. And when you talk about Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of Netherlands, you can see Klaus Schwab going, where do you find such prime ministers as Mark Rutte? You know, did you see him say? I watch your Twitter, Jordan, and I watch a lot of your podcast. I know you know what's going on because you talk about it all the time. You attack Trudeau, it seems like every 2 hours, right? I mean, you know exactly what's happening. This is
that's because I don't have enough time to do it more. Yeah, well,
yeah, I know
on the digital currency front, I mean, well, one of the things we should point out to everybody who's watching and listening is that we're already 3/4 of the way down the digital currency pipeline, because there isn't really much difference between a credit card or a bank card and digital currency. And the reason I say there's not much difference is because when you use a credit card or a bank card to make a transaction, there's a digital record of the transaction, and then that digital record can be brokered. And so far, mostly it's brokered to other corporations, which isn't as totalitarian as it might be, because so far, most corporations just want your money so they can sell you things. Now, that can be problematic because you can have things pushed on you by what do you call corporations that are going a little bit farther than they should, that you don't really need or want, but at least you get something out of the bargain. But once we're fully digital in our currency, that'll mean the government will be able to track absolutely every bloody thing you ever do, and also be able to do things like they're already doing in China. So the Chinese government has put expiry dates on some digital currency. So they, if they need to have the population spend more, let's say because there is a recession, they could just put in an edict that would make sure that your money depreciated by 2% every month, so that would be an impetus to spending. And they could do the reverse if they wanted you to save. And so it means in potential the emergence of a system for comprehensive control that's so complete that we can barely imagine it. And we might say, well, isn't that paranoid? And I would say, look, we still think we were in a COVID epidemic. What we were really in was an epidemic of imitating the Chinese communists. And we ran to imitate them as fast as we possibly could. And that Chinese communist regime, they just re-elected Xi Jinping the other day with a 2,952 to 0 margin for the next 5 years. The probability that he's president for life is extraordinarily high. And so we are in danger of using the Chinese Communist Party and its vaunted efficiencies on the energy and environment front as a model for totalitarian governance across the world. We thought when we integrated China into the world economy that the Chinese would turn into a Western democracy. But what's happening instead, I would say, is that because we've invited the Chinese to the table, we're turning into the CCP. Yeah, and people are certainly not, and we're doing it under the guise of this idiot protect the virginal planet environmentalism that's all motivated by this, what would you say, fear-mongering apocalypse narrative.
That's probably the fundamental question of our time. So that's why we have to say no to all of these things. We have to say no to CBDCs, we have to say no to digital identity, we have to say no to 15-minute cities, because they're all the same thing. But it's problematic, it's hard in Western society, in the mind of modern men nowadays, to tell them that, those nice little pretexts that they use to sell this to us are not actually the truth. We need a return to real ethical debate about where we want to go as a civilization. And that's why it's so important, I think, what you are trying to do also with an alternative to something like the World Economic Forum, because those discussions are not being held. We are being sold lies, we are being sold false premises, pretexts, and we are forced to debate within that circle of lies oftentimes, and it's the exact same thing with the Dutch farmers. That's why they're all these subjects are related to each other, because they're all a matter of, are we going to give up our freedom for a bit of convenience, or for those nice words that they try to sell us? And I think the answer should be absolutely not, but it's hard.
Yeah. Well, and then on the digital currency front, and Eva, I'll turn to this alternative that you described in a minute. On the digital currency front, I think something like a digital currency is inevitable because we're already 3/4 of the way there. And the only real alternative I can see to the top-down centralized digital currency that's being offered by the governments in collusion, let's say with the WEF, is going to be something like a decentralized system. And it looks to me like the best decentralized system that's in place for currency at the moment is Bitcoin. And I don't know if Bitcoin's the solution, but I don't think any of the other electronic coins, digital currencies, have the same advantages or the same genuine radical decentralization as Bitcoin. And then, Eva, you mentioned this alternative to the WEF that has been generated in the UK. So, and one of the things we're working through is what the story that might unite us might be. And the story that we're being presented right now is that human activity, especially at the industrial level, is intrinsically destructive in relationship to pristine nature and has to be limited by force if necessary because there's an apocalyptic emergency at hand. And I do not believe for a moment that there is a single apocalyptic emergency at hand. There may be a multitude of them in many different directions, but to assume that it's a mere consequence, let's say, of nitrogen overproduction or carbon overproduction is a radical oversimplification of pathological magnitude. And I also don't believe the idea that limits to growth that are opposed from the top down are the only way that human beings can manage, what would you say, harmonious relationships with the broader biosphere. I think instead that if we got our structures of governance put in place properly, like they generally are in free Western countries, that people could cooperate well enough so that everyone could be rich, including the absolutely poor around the world, and that rich people who have opportunity and a certain degree of security would start to attend to local environmental concerns in a manner that would make the planet greener and more sustainable. I think we could have our cake and eat it too. And this enterprise you described, which is the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, is going to have its inaugural conference October 31st, November 1st, and November 2nd. I hope you two can attend, and with a big public event right in the middle of it that we hope to bring approximately 20,000 people to. But we're trying to put forward a vision of abundance and freedom and, let's say, environmental stewardship, so mature relationship. And so that's definitely underway, and we have a lot of the public have already clambered on board. I've got a mailing list of about 40,000 people, and we have a large number of well-positioned cultural, artistic, business, and political leaders on board as well. We're trying not to make it an elitist enterprise for the reasons that we've already described. And I think everybody who's part of the core group really is afraid of elitist enterprises, and also concerned that any attempts on the international level are likely to turn into nothing but an elitist enterprise. But we're at least going to try to put forward a vision that's much more voluntary and decentralized and positive than this bloody top-down Tower of Babel centralized apocalypse narrative that everybody's being force-fed now.
It's so funny to me always how they attack the minds of people, really, and especially young minds, from both ways. It's on the one hand this apocalyptic, like the whole world is going to come to an end, a really alarmist story. And then on the other hand, on the individual level, it's an anything goes story. Everything is relative, you know? There's your truth, there's my truth, there's nothing such as an absolute truth, you know? There's no God, there's no real morality, everything goes. And that combination is so incredibly deadly. And that's why I think it's so important what you're doing with this, and we need to counter it.